As we prepare to look at creating a survey and developing our questions, let's talk about some attitude scales, because it's likely in your survey you are asking or doing this survey because you want to get at people's opinions. So let's look at different ways to get at attitudes or opinions, way we could design our questions. So we're going to look at graphic rating scales, itemized rating scales, rank order, Q sorting, paired comparison, constant sum, semantic differentials, staple, Likert, and purchase intent scales. Let's start with the graphic rating scales. So a graphic rating scale, let's just define this here, is a measurement scale that includes a graphic continuum, anchored by two extremes. So the benefit of a graphic rating scale is it's very simple to use. We can decide how big the scale is, so how much distinction can be made. Of course, you want to recognize your people who are responding. Can they tell or feel a difference? So if you have too many different points on your continuum, is there really a difference? So for example, this one here, how comfortable is the Mountain Equipment Co-op backpack? This scale is a 10-point scale. When people wear this backpack, do they really feel a difference, say, between a 3 and a 4 on this scale, or between a 7 and an 8? This might be too many points on a scale. Typically, when we do rating scales, whether it's the graphic rating or the itemized rating we're going to look at next, we usually do 5 or 7 points on the scale. That allows for enough distinction. As we talked about in our previous video, there is a tendency in some cultures to not pick the two most extreme. So if you have a 5-point scale, few people will pick ones on the outside, which leave the 3 in the middle. It's an odd number, which allows for, if you're pretty neutral on this, to choose neutrality. You could instead have an even number if you wanted to force there to not be neutrality. But we typically pick a 5. Or you could pick 7 if you need a little bit more detail in terms of that, how fine the distinctions are between the different points. Now, this assumes that the participant actually can distinguish between, so it is something that they have feelings about, as opposed to just a yes or no. This needs to be something where they are more positive or negative. Or we could have scales like the one you see at the bottom, where you have an extreme, which is it's comfortable, on the other extreme it's uncomfortable, and we're picking a point in between. Now, even though this is a rating, which makes it ordinal data, when you have rating scales, we treat them as interval data. So this is important to remember. We'll talk about this again as we get into some analysis, but even though it is actually a rating, it's actually treated as interval when we do the analysis. What does that mean? That means that we are going to summarize this data with a median or a mean, and we will look at things like standard deviation to look at variability in the responses. So we treat it as interval data, even though as a rating, it's actually ordinal. So as we look at cultures, there are different cultural differences. So what you see here at the most extremes, here, Russians, for example, are more likely, if you give them a 5 or 7 point scale, they are more likely to choose those outside points, the most extreme responses. Whereas we get here, middle of the road, the central responses are more likely. So you can see here the US, we can see China, United Kingdom, Canada's also in here in the middle. We tend to pick those responses that are towards the center. So we don't tend to pick as big as extremes. Now, you have decisions to make as you're designing your rating scale. That is, how many on your scale between very satisfied and very dissatisfied? Is it a 5-point scale? Is it a 7-point scale? And then do you have a number in the middle? You're using an odd number. So you can choose to not have an odd number and make it 4. For example, this very satisfied to very dissatisfied, 1 through 4. The risk with this, though, is that you are forcing people to have an opinion. Are they unhappy or happy? What if they truly are neutral? So by not having that neutral option, you are forcing them to have an opinion they may not actually have. So what we tend to do is have an odd number with that neutral in the middle. Otherwise, you might do an even number and have an NA or not applicable, where they choose not to respond to that particular question if they don't actually have an opinion. So you can go those different routes. We'll talk about that more in a later video. So the graphic rating scale was like what we see on Amazon, right? You see the stars here and you click in how many stars you give a particular product. That's a graphic rating scale. They're very common. We know how to use them, right? They're very easy to use. You simply click on how many stars out of the 5 apply to you. So we know more stars are better. We know how to deal with them as a person who's responding to the question. The key is that if you're analyzing that data, is to treat it as interval. When you're doing a survey, you might, instead of having a graphic rating scale where we have some kind of visual, we might instead have a itemized rating scale. An itemized rating scale is the same kind of thing. So here we have a measurement scale. And our measurement scale in which the respondent selects an answer from a limited number of ordered categories. So same as the graphic rating. The difference is it's not pictures. Instead, what we have here, and this is kind of the general one you think about in terms of a survey, is that we give you a number of options, but those options, those categories we give you, have an order to them. So how interested would you be in obtaining additional information about this product? Extremely interested, very interested, somewhat interested, not very interested, to not at all interested. One of the choices you have as you develop this type of scale is, do you start with the good or do you start with the bad? So you can see here on this example on the left, not at all likely to use is on the left, extremely likely to use is on the right. On the bottom here, you can see the very satisfied is on one end, very dissatisfied is on the other. So you decide which direction you want to go from. Typically when we're coding data, we expect the unhappy, the dissatisfied to be the lower number, and the more likely to use, very satisfied, happy, tends to be the higher number. It simplifies the coding when we're trying to do the analysis later if we just constantly think that the higher numbers are better, because intuitively humans are kind of geared towards the fact that higher numbers are better. If you do a survey like this, it tends to freak people out and they may answer the survey incorrectly because they're used to higher being better, and so they may not see or pay close enough attention to realize the very dissatisfied is actually the 5 and the very satisfied is the 1, and they may answer your survey incorrectly, which then we have a validity problem, right? Because those who are paying attention closely answer one way, and those who are not paid a different way, and then we're not actually measuring what we think we're measuring. So we tend to put higher numbers are better. The only downside to doing that, it makes coding way easier, but the downside to doing that is that people may not actually spend a whole lot of time or pay a whole lot of attention to your survey, in which case they're like, I'm generally happy with whatever your organization is, I'm going with that. Or I'm generally upset with your organization, so I'm going to go with this, rather than paying attention to what each question is. If you have questions that are more worded like this, as opposed to here's a bunch of characteristics, rate them between 1 and 5 or between 1 and 7, you do have the ability to kind of switch it around a bit more without it causing too many problems. Again, when you code, then you can go back and say, okay, well, even if I made this one first, I'll call this 5 in my coding. Or if I put it last, I can still call it 5 in my coding because the coding part isn't seen by the respondent. And coding being just simply how we're going to make it easy to analyze. And we'll talk in a later video how we go about coding surveys to make it faster to do the analysis. Now, when you are doing itemized rating scales, you got to figure out what is it that you're going to have as your options. You can specify one extreme and the other and simply have numbers in between, like not all likely to use, extremely likely to use, and just 1 through 7, or satisfied, very dissatisfied, 1 through 5. But you may also want to provide explicitly what those different categories are. So some examples of categories would depend on what it is you are trying to measure. So if you're trying to measure style, we can go from very stylish, somewhat stylish, not very stylish, completely unstylish. Notice that's a 4-point scale that doesn't have a kind of a neutral. What's the quality? Very good to poor. Strongly agree to strongly disagree. We see that one a lot. The purchase intent, we'll talk about in a separate video all on its own. So you're going to pick the different categories based on the topic that you are measuring, whether it's cost or ease of use or style or satisfaction. The thing to remember with these types of scales is that you need to make sure they are clear so there is a difference between somewhat and completely. Not very and somewhat, somewhat and very. There need to be a discernible difference. Be very careful that when you're picking your different categories, that it's not just words that would be interpreted as the same thing. It needs to be something where it's incrementally getting better or incrementally getting worse. So I actually like to keep on hand this Likert scale response anchors that comes from Vegas, from Wade Vegas, from Clemson University, and I'm just gonna zoom in a bit more so we can see here. And I use this when I'm building surveys. I go back to this document to help me in terms of designing the scales. So am I asking about acceptability? Here's a 7-point scale. Am I asking about priorities? Here's a 7-point scale. Am I asking about level of support, the probability something's going to happen? My level of agreement, strongly agree to strongly disagree, that's your 5-point standard scale. But I could also ask about participation, level of desirability, frequency on a 5-point scale, level of consideration, does this reflect me and how I feel? So these are great examples to help you kind of standardize what the options should be for your particular scale. There's some more here. You'll notice they're almost all 5 to 7-point scales. Here's level of quality, level of satisfaction on a 5 or 7-point scale. Okay. Likelihood, level of difficulty, amount of use, level of satisfaction, level of influence. So the common scales that you would use. And by using these standards, the benefit is that it's things people have seen before, but it also ensures that when you are picking the wording for the different categories, they don't overlap or get misinterpreted as meaning the same thing or the opposite thing than you intended. So this is a great source for helping you build those scales.